with me. Don't close your eyes, Githme. Look at me. Just keep looking at me.
Why would you do that?
Because there's nobody else here. And I'm not going anywhere.
The concrete is hot enough to blister, and an 18-year-old girl is kneeling on it anyway. Her knees are pressed into a sidewalk that has been baking since dawn, and she doesn't feel it. Her hands are shaking. Her voice keeps cracking on the same word, please, over and over. Like if she says it enough times, it will become true. She hasn't eaten since yesterday morning, and her stomach is a clenched fist behind her ribs, but that isn't the thing she's thinking about. The thing she's thinking about is the old man slumped sideways on the park bench in front of her. His skin has gone the color of dishwater. His lips are split and dry. Each breath comes thin and far apart, like a door swinging shut a little more each time he is leaving. She can feel it the way you feel a storm coming before the first drop lands. She pulls a folded napkin from her pocket. Inside it is one slice of bread. Plain, slightly squashed from being carried all morning. It is, though he will never know this, and she will never tell him, the last food in her entire house. She tears off a corner and presses it to his mouth. His eyes drag open barely. Why would you do that? Because there's nobody else here, she says. And I'm not going anywhere. She didn't know it yet. But that one torn corner of bread was about to turn her whole life inside out. And the man dying on that bench was about to become the most important stranger she would ever meet. Before the car came, before the name, before any of it, you need to understand exactly how little Maren Calloway had, and exactly how much she gave away anyway. Larkin Flats sits on the east side of Shreveport, Louisiana, and if you've never been, let me put you on the street so you can see it the way Maren saw it every single morning of her life. Half the houses on her block are boarded over, plywood gone soft and gray at the edges from years of rain. The sidewalks are split so deep that weeds shoulder up through them, little green fists punching out of the dark. The streetlights flicker on and off after dusk, like they can't quite decide whether the block is worth the electricity. There used to be an ice cream truck that came through in summer, tinny music and all. It stopped coming so long ago that the younger kids don't believe the older kids when they talk about it. Maren Calloway lived in a narrow shotgun house, with paint the color of old teeth, a porch that groaned under any weight, and a screen door that had not latched right since before she was tall enough to reach the handle. She had lived there her whole life. She lived there with her grandmother, Ruth Calloway, 72 years old, with hands that had worked every day they were given. Ruth sorted donations at the Goodwill warehouse off the highway. On Saturdays, she scrubbed the floors at the church 2 streets over. For most of Maren's childhood, she had also folded other people's laundry for cash, pressing creases into shirts that would never hang in her own closet, so that her granddaughter would have a roof and a bed and a light to read by. Ruth had raised Maren since the girl was 3. Maren's mother had died when Maren was too small to keep the memory of her face, only a feeling, warm and gone. Complications from diabetes that went untreated because there was no insurance and no money for the medicine that might have held it back. She was 29. Maren's father lasted 6 more months and then left without a note or a phone call, just an empty hook where his jacket used to hang. Maren had never asked much about either of them. There was a single photograph of her mother on the windowsill. The front room, the glass clouded a little from years of Louisiana humidity, and sometimes in the evening the light came through it sideways and lit the woman's face. And Maren would look at it for a second on her way past and then keep moving, the way you touch a door frame for luck without thinking about it. Ruth never pushed. Ruth had learned a long time ago that some doors a person opens on their own time or not at all, and that the kindest thing you can do is leave the hinge oiled and the latch off. You should understand what kind of house this was, underneath the peeling paint. It was a house that ran on small, fierce economies, tea bags wrung out and used again, soap slivers pressed together into one new bar, a coffee can on the top shelf where Ruth dropped whatever change survived the week, and the soft musical sound it made when she shook it to gauge how close they were to the edge. Maren had grown up reading that sound the way other kids read the weather. A heavy, full rattle meant maybe a little extra in the pot on Sunday. A thin, scattered one meant not this week, baby, and she learned not to ask. So it was Ruth, it had always been Ruth. But Ruth's knees were failing her now. Some mornings she couldn't rise from the edge of the bed without gripping the frame and breathing through her teeth. She'd begun missing shifts at the warehouse. 1 week, then another, and every missed shift was another bill that slid past due. On the door of their refrigerator, held there by a little magnet shaped like a cross, was a disconnection notice from the power company. 12 days to pay. The notice was already 10 days old. Behind that door, the refrigerator was nearly empty. A squeeze bottle of ketchup half gone, a box of baking soda, a handful of condiment packets Maren had saved from the gas station, soy sauce, hot mustard, 2 little tubs of grape jelly. That was the inventory. Here is the thing about Maren, though, and it matters more than the empty fridge. She never complained. Not once that Ruth could remember. Every morning she got up before her grandmother, walked into that bare kitchen, and made 2 slices of bread. One for Ruth, one for herself. Sometimes there was a scrape of peanut butter. Sometimes a thin smear of margarine. Sometimes there was nothing on the bread at all, and she ate it like that and called it breakfast. She would wrap Ruth's slices in a paper towel and set it on the nightstand beside her grandmother's bed, and she'd leave for school without making a sound. It was a ritual neither of them ever named out loud, which is exactly what made it sacred. Maren was 18 now, about to start her senior year at Eastgate High. She was quiet, watchful, the kind of girl who held doors for strangers and never waited around for the thank you. The kind who noticed when a classmate had no lunch and slid half of hers across the cafeteria table without a word, the way you'd pass the salt like it was nothing, like it cost nothing. Her counselor, a tired and decent man named Leonard Pruitt, had told Ruth once at a parent meeting, "Mrs. Calloway, your granddaughter has more decency in her than people 3 times her age. I don't know where she got it." Ruth had only smiled and said, "I know exactly where she got it." But Maren had a private world, too. She carried a small sketchbook everywhere, tucked into her backpack, pulled out on the bus, opened across her knees at lunch. She drew the people in the neighborhood. The man who sold cut fruit out of a cooler on the corner. The woman 2 doors down who sat on her porch every evening and sang hymns to no one in particular, her voice cracking on the high notes. The kids who shot baskets at a milk crate someone had nailed to a phone pole. She drew them carefully, like each pencil line was a way of saying, "I see you. You count." And on the last page of that sketchbook, a page she never turned to in front of anyone, she'd drawn something else. A house with a garden out front, a kitchen with a bowl of fruit on the counter, actual fruit, not condiment packets. Ruth in a rocking chair smiling, her face soft and unpinched by pain. At the bottom of the page, Maren had copied a line she'd read on the corkboard at church. "What is done in secret is seen." Because Maren had a dream, and the dream had a name. She wanted to be an architect, not just someone who put up walls, someone who designed spaces that made people feel safe, feel noticed, feel like they belonged somewhere. She didn't talk about it. Dreams feel breakable when you aren't sure where the next meal is coming from. So she held it the way you hold a candle outdoors, both hands cupped around the small flame. Every Saturday she volunteered at the food pantry that Pastor Gail Mathers ran out of the church basement. Maren stacked cans, sorted bags, carried boxes out to the cars of elderly neighbors whose backs wouldn't bend anymore. And here is the part that catches in my throat every time I think about it. Maren qualified to receive food from that pantry. She and Ruth both did. She never took a single bag. Pastor Mathers asked her about it once, gently. "Honey, you know this is for you, too. You're allowed." Maren just shook her head. Somebody needs it worse than us. 18 years old, empty refrigerator, and what she said was, somebody needs it worse. On her walk to the pantry, she always cut through Holloway Park, a small tired square of grass with a clouded green pond and a row of old benches. She liked one bench in particular near the water, and she'd sit there and sketch the surface of the pond when the light was right. She never once paid attention to the small brass plaque bolted to the backrest, faded and half swallowed under peeling green paint. If she had leaned in and read it, she'd have seen the words "donated by the Renfrew Foundation, 1991. But she didn't, not yet. That forgotten little bench was about to become the most important place she'd ever stand. She had no idea that the last slice of bread in that house would turn out to be the most expensive thing she would ever give away. That morning began like every other morning in the Calloway house, except that it was worse. Ruth had had a bad night. Maren had heard it through the thin wall, the wet, broken coughing, the small sounds her grandmother made when she shifted her weight and her knees objected. When Marin came into the kitchen at first light, Ruth was already at the table, hunched forward, rubbing both knees with the heels of her hands in slow circles, the way you'd try to start a fire. "Morning, Grandma, I'll fix your bread." Ruth shook her head. "I'm not hungry, baby, you eat." It was a lie, and Marin knew it. Ruth always announced she wasn't hungry on the mornings there wasn't enough. It was her way of making sure the girl ate. She'd been doing it for years, and she thought Marin hadn't noticed, and Marin had noticed every single time, and neither of them ever said so. Marin opened the bread bag. 2 slices left, the heels of the loaf slightly dry, the last 2. She stood there a moment, looking at them. Then she scraped the very bottom of the peanut butter jar. She had to press the knife so hard against the plastic that it squeaked and got just enough to gray 1 slice. She wrapped it in a paper towel and carried it to the nightstand for Ruth, the way she always did. The second slice she folded into a clean napkin, plain, nothing on it, and slid it into the front pocket of her jeans. For later, she told herself. As if there would be a later, as if there were anything behind it. There wasn't. After these 2 slices, the bag was empty, the pantry shelf was empty. The fridge held ketchup and baking soda and 3 condiment packets. There was no backup, no emergency can in the back of a cabinet. This was the floor, and they had reached it. She did the math on the coffee can while the kettle ticked on the stove. She knew what was in it without lifting the lid. A few dollars in quarters, a fold of single bills soft as cloth from handling. Enough for 1 trip to the corner store if she was careful, and she was always careful. But there was the power bill standing over all of it like a man in a doorway, 12 days now down to 2. And Marin had already decided without quite letting herself say it that the lights mattered more than the bread did. Bread you could go without for a day, 2 days. You learned how to make your stomach quiet. But the dark was different. The dark was when Ruth couldn't see the steps in the medicine bottles, when the box fans stopped and the heat came in and sat on your chest all night, so the can would stay shut a little longer. They'd figure the bread out somehow, they always had. School was out for the summer, so Marin had nowhere she had to be. She thought about walking up to the corner store to see whether Mr. Tatum needed help sweeping. He paid a few dollars sometimes, but the store didn't open until noon, and it wasn't yet 9. So she pulled her sketchbook out from under her bed, told Ruth she was going to the park to draw, and stepped out into the heat. Late July in Shreveport is a kind of cruelty. By mid-morning the air was already thick and wet, the sky a flat white sheet, the asphalt soft enough to hold a shoe print. Heat shimmered up off the pavement in long crawling waves. It was the kind of heat that kills people every summer, and you know which people. The old ones, the poor ones, the ones living alone in houses with no air conditioning that nobody thinks to check on. Marin walked her usual path through Holloway Park, past the rusted swing set with its 1 remaining chain, past the pond and its skin of green algae toward her bench. But the bench wasn't empty. There was no later. After that slice, the kitchen was bare to the walls, and she was about to give it to a man she had never seen before in her life. Someone was already on her bench. An old man slumped sideways against the armrest like he'd been set down there and forgotten. His skin was wrong, not just pale, but a kind of grayish white, the color of a wax candle. A thin shine of sweat ran down from his temple even though he was wearing a wool cardigan. A wool cardigan buttoned to the throat in 95-degree heat. His eyes were half open and seeing nothing. His breath came in quick, shallow sips that plainly weren't enough, with a low rattle underneath each one, like something dragged across gravel. A wooden cane lay on the ground beside the bench where it had slid out of his hand. Marin stopped walking. Her first feeling was fear, plain animal caution. She was a girl alone in a half-empty park, and this was a stranger, an old man she had never seen, and everything sensible in her said, "Keep walking, mind your business, this is not yours to fix." She actually took half a step back. Then she heard the rattle again, that dragging sound on the inhale, like air forcing its way past something that didn't want to let it through, and the fear turned into something else. She crossed the grass, her sneakers crunching on the dry, brittle blades. "Sir, sir, can you hear me?" Nothing, just that terrible breathing. She knelt down beside the bench and his face was right there, close, and she could see the deep grooves around his eyes, the cracked lips, the slack hang of his jaw. His hand trembled where it rested on his knee, not the shake of cold, the shake of a body running out. That was when she started noticing things that didn't fit. His wallet had fallen open on the bench beside him. No cash. Just a worn photograph of a woman with kind eyes and a business card lying face down, half tucked beneath his leg. Maren didn't touch any of it, but she saw his shoes, dark brown leather, scuffed and dusted from a long walk, but the stitching was fine and tight, and the soles were thick and good. These were not shoes from the Goodwill bin she'd grown up wearing. These were shoes that cost more than a month of their rent, and the cardigan that made no sense in this heat had a small monogram stitched into the left cuff. 2 letters. She couldn't read them from where she knelt, and she didn't try, because none of it mattered right now. What mattered was that the man was dying. His skin was hot, not feverish, cooked, the heat of someone who'd been sitting in the open sun too long with too little water. Pastor Mathers had run a first aid afternoon at the church last summer, and Moran reached back for it now. Heat stroke, severe dehydration, maybe worse. Cool them down, get fluids in, don't let them slip under. But she had no phone, no water bottle, no money, nothing. Nothing except one plain slice of bread folded in a napkin in her pocket. Her stomach growled, long and low, and she couldn't have hidden it if she'd wanted to. She looked at the bread through the denim. She looked at the man. And then she stopped thinking, because thinking was the thing that would have stopped her. She ran. The park's old water fountain stood near the swing set, and she hit the button and a thin, tired trickle of warm water dribbled out. She cupped both hands under it and waited while it pooled, slow, agonizingly slow in her palms. Then she turned and ran back, and half of it leaked away between her fingers before she reached the bench, leaving a trail of dark spots across the bright concrete. What was left she pressed to his forehead, his neck, the hollows of his cheeks. "Stay with me. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." Back to the fountain, cup, wait, run. This time she let the water drip onto his lips, slow and careful, the way you'd water a plant that was almost gone. Not too much, not too fast. His mouth twitched, a third trip, a fourth. Each time less water survived the run, and each time she pressed what little there was to his skin like it was the most precious thing she'd ever carried. By the 4th trip her own legs were shaking. The heat was pressing down on her too, and she hadn't eaten and she hadn't drunk. And the white sky overhead seemed to lean closer. She didn't stop. The smell of him reached her then, and it told its own story. Not unwashed, clean even, faintly of cedar and some good soap. The smell of a man who lived somewhere with a proper bath, but under it was the sour copper edge of a body in trouble. The smell that comes when the engine starts to fail. And she knew it from the day they'd come for old Mr. Reyes 2 houses down and carried him out under a sheet in the same kind of July. She fanned harder, she talked faster. She told him it was almost evening, that it would cool down soon, that he just had to make it to the shade of the long light, and she didn't know if any of it was getting through, but she said it anyway, because the saying was a rope and she was going to keep throwing it. Then she reached into her pocket. The napkin was damp with the sweat off her thigh. She unfolded it. The slice of bread sat in her palm, plain and pale and a little squashed. The last food in her house. The last thing standing between the two of them in an empty kitchen and a grandmother pretending not to be hungry so the girl could eat. Her stomach screamed at her, loud and furious. She tore off a corner and pressed it gently to the old man's mouth. "Here, eat this. Just a little, okay? Just a little." His lips parted. She laid the piece on his tongue. He chewed, weak, slow, like the muscles of his jaw had nearly quit, and swallowed. She tore another corner, then another. She fed him the way Ruth fed the sparrows off the porch rail on Sunday mornings, pinch by pinch, no rush, all patience. "There you go. You're doing good. Keep going." Piece by piece the bread disappeared. All of it, every last crumb. She brushed her empty palm against her jeans. Her stomach was a riot now, but her face stayed calm. Like this was the most ordinary thing in the world. Like she had not just handed away the only meal she had to a man whose name she didn't know. And then his eyes opened. Not halfway, not fluttering, all the way. And Maren saw something she had not expected. His eyes were a sharp, clear, startling blue, wide awake, taking everything in, like a light snapping on behind frosted glass. These were not the eyes of a confused old man who'd wandered off and gotten lost. These were the eyes of someone paying very, very close attention. He looked at her, really looked, and his voice came out low and rough and steady. "You shouldn't have done that." "I had to," she said. "You needed it more than me." He held her in that blue stare for a long moment, like he was working a problem he hadn't expected to find sitting on a park bench. "What's your name?" "Maren, Maren Calloway." He repeated it quietly, almost to himself. "Maren Calloway. like he was writing it down somewhere on the inside of his skull. She pulled off the loose flannel she wore open over her tank top, jogged it to the fountain, soaked it, wrung it half dry, and came back and draped it across his shoulders. Then she sat down beside him on the bench and started fanning him with her sketchbook, back and forth, slow and steady, while the sun climbed. They sat there over an hour. She kept talking to keep him with her. She told him about Ruth, how she made the best sweet potato pie in the parish and refused to give the recipe to a living soul, not even the pastor. She told him about the pond, how it used to have fish in it when she was small, real fish, before they all vanished one summer and nobody knew why. She told him about her drawings. You draw? His voice was coming back now, gaining weight. Mostly people, she said. From around here, what else? Buildings, houses, things I'd like to build one day. You want to build things. I want to be an architect. She said it plainly, because he was a stranger and strangers are sometimes the safest people to say a true thing to. Spaces that make people feel safe, feel like they're supposed to be there. He went quiet then, really quiet. He turned his head and looked at her with that same blue stare and said almost under his breath, "An architect." She showed him a page because he asked. It was a drawing of the woman down the block who sang hymns to nobody, caught mid-note with her head tipped back and her eyes shut, and Marin had spent a long time getting the loose skin of the throat right, the way it strained on the high parts. He held the sketchbook in both hands and looked at it for what felt to her like an uncomfortably long time, and when he handed it back he didn't say that's nice the way adults say it to children. He said, "You drew her like she matters." And Marin didn't know how to answer that, so she just took the book back and looked at her own drawing, like she was seeing it through somebody else's eyes for the first time. As the hour wore on, the gray drained out of his skin and color came back into his face, his breathing evened. He sat up straighter against the bench and he began to ask questions, not the polite drifting kind, but sharp ones, exact ones. Where did she live? Who took care of her? Just the two of them. What school? What did she want after that? She answered them all, simply, while she fanned him, and he nodded slowly at each one like he was checking boxes on a list she couldn't see. When the sun finally started its long slide toward the tree line, Marin stood. "Sir, I should find somebody with a phone. Call for help." He raised a hand, gentle. "No, someone's coming for me. I just walked farther than I meant to today." He paused, and the next words came softer. "Thank you for the bread." She picked up her sketchbook and brushed off her jeans. "You sure you'll be all right?" "I'm sure." She nodded and walked away, slow, her stomach hollow and her heart oddly full, and she did not look back. If she had looked back, she would have seen his face change. The weakness fell away from it like a dropped sheet. The helplessness went with it. His jaw set. His blue eyes locked onto her back and tracked her all the way to the corner, and they did not leave her until she turned and was gone. 30 seconds later, a black SUV slid up to the curb. A broad-shouldered man in a gray suit got out fast and crossed to the bench. "Mr. Renfrew, we've had people looking for you all over the east side." The old man lifted a hand, calm, unhurried. "I'm all right, Hank. A beat. But I need you to find out everything there is to know about a girl named Marin Calloway. Everything by tonight." He didn't want her thanked. He wanted her found. Marin went home that evening and told her grandmother she wasn't hungry. It was the second lie she'd told that week, and it was the most generous one. Ruth was at the kitchen table when Marin came in, a shoebox of bills open in front of her, envelopes with red ink, final notices, letters from collection agencies with their flat, polite threats. Ruth's reading glasses had slid low on her nose and her hands were still on the table, not sorting, just resting, and she looked tired in a way that went past the regular kind. The kind of tired that is set up inside the bones and intends to stay. "Where you been, baby?" "Park drawing. You eat?" "Yes, ma'am." A lie, the third one if you were counting. Ruth studied her a moment. Grandmothers have a way of knowing, but Ruth didn't push it. Maybe she didn't have the energy. Maybe she already knew exactly what was missing from the bread bag and didn't have the heart to make the girl say it out loud. Marin boiled water on the stove and dropped in a tea bag that had already been used twice. The water barely changed color, the palest brown, hardly tea at all. She set a cup in front of Ruth and sat across from her. "I met somebody at the park today, Grandma." "Who's that?" "An old man. He was real sick. Heat got him, I think. He couldn't even talk when I found him." Ruth looked up. "You were out there with him by yourself? Wasn't anybody else around?" "I gave him some water, fanned him with my book." A small pause she couldn't quite step over. Gave him something to eat. Ruth didn't ask what. She didn't need to. She knew what had been in the bread bag that morning, and she knew what wasn't in it tonight. She reached across the table and laid her hand over Marin's, her fingers cool and dry and certain. "You did right," she said. "You hear me? You did right." They sat in the quiet kitchen while the refrigerator hummed its tired hum, and the disconnection notice fluttered a little under the cross-shaped magnet, and neither of them said one word about supper. The next morning, call it day 2, Marin woke early out of pure habit. Her body still didn't know there was no bread to prepare. She stepped onto the porch to shake out the doormat and stopped cold. There was an envelope tucked half under the mat. White, heavy paper, no stamp, no address. Just her name on the front, Marin, in careful, old-fashioned handwriting, the kind of script you almost never see anymore. She opened it. Inside was a $200 bill's worth of 20s, crisp and new, paper-clipped together, and a note on thick, cream-colored stationery that felt like cloth between her fingers. "For the girl who shared her bread, AR." Marin's hands shook. She turned the note over. Nothing on the back. She held the money up to the morning light like it might dissolve, then carried it inside and showed Ruth. Ruth's eyes went wide. She touched the stationery with her fingertips, running her thumb across the surface. It was heavy and rich, the kind of paper that comes off a desk, not out of a drugstore rack. "Who's AR?" she whispered. "I don't know, Grandma. Maybe the man from the park." Ruth held the note a long time and said nothing. "Now you have to understand what $200 was to Marin Calloway. That was groceries for 2 weeks. That was more than half the power bill. That was the difference between the lights staying on and the lights going out. That was survival, set right there in her palm. You know what she did with it? She walked it straight down to Pastor Gail Mathers at the church, and she handed it over. "Put it in the pantry fund, Pastor." The pastor stared at her. "Sweetheart, you need this more than anyone who's going to walk through that door today. I know your situation. Keep it." Marin shook her head. "Somebody gave it to me because I helped, so I should keep helping. That's how it's supposed to work." Pastor Mathers's eyes filled. She pulled the girl into a hug and held on, and over Marin's shoulder she looked down at the cream-colored note still in her own hand, and her thumb brushed across something embossed at the top, a small, elegant letter R set inside a geometric crest. Her brow tightened just for a second, like she'd seen that mark somewhere before, on a building, on a brass plate, on a donor wall. But she didn't say anything, and Marin walked home still broke, still hungry, and entirely at peace with it. That walk home is the part I want you to hold on to, by the way, because there was no audience for it, no camera. The reporter and the morning show and the 2 million shares were all still a year away, and Marin had no idea any of it was coming. She gave the money away in a church's basement that smelled of cardboard and floor wax, with one witness who'd been sworn to nothing, and then she walked back through the heat to a house with an empty bread bag, and she was glad. Not noble about it, not making a thing of it. Just glad, the simple, uncomplicated way you're glad when you've done the thing you already knew you were going to do. That's the kind of person she was when nobody was looking. Keep that in your pocket for the end. The envelopes weren't finished. That same evening, Marin found a second one waiting on the porch. This one was different, no money inside. Instead, a slim black box. She lifted the lid and her breath snagged. A set of professional drawing pencils. 12 of them, graded and labeled, each one sharpened to a perfect point. The kind she'd only ever seen behind locked glass at the art supply store downtown. The store she walked past but never walked into, because a single one of anything in there cost more than she'd make in a month of sweeping for Mr. Tatum. And underneath the pencils, a sketch pad. Thick, heavy archival paper, the kind real architects use, the kind that holds a line like it means it. The note read, "For the architect." Marin's skin went cold in the warm evening air, because she hadn't told anyone she wanted to be an architect. Not Pastor Mathers, not Mr. Pruitt, not a single friend, not Ruth in so many words, the only living person she had ever said those words to. The only one was the old man on the bench. She sat down on the porch steps and looked at the pencils for a long while. Somewhere down the block a dog barked twice and gave up. A screen door slapped shut. The evening was warm and heavy and gold at the edges. "Grandma," she called softly, "come see this." Ruth came to the door, saw the pencils, read the note. This time she did not smile. Her face drew tight. "Who is this person, Marin? How does he know what you want to be?" I told him, at the park, we were just talking, Grandma, that's all. Ruth stood in the doorway a long time, arms crossed, lips pressed thin. Grateful, yes. But uneasy too, the way you'd feel if you came home and found your front door standing open and everything still inside. Like someone was watching her family and she couldn't yet tell whether to call it a blessing or a warning. By morning there would be a black SUV parked across the street from the house, and it would not be leaving. Day 3. Marin walked up toward the corner store to ask Mr. Tatum about sweeping, and on the way she saw something that hadn't been there before. A black SUV parked across the street from her house, tinted engine off. It hadn't been there the day before. She slowed, looked at it, looked away, kept walking, and told herself it was nothing. At the park she went straight to her bench, and the old man wasn't there. But the bench was different. It had been cleaned, repainted, the peeling green gone, replaced by smooth dark wood that someone had clearly sanded and oiled by hand. And the brass plaque on the backrest, the one she'd never bothered to read, had been polished until it gleamed like a coin. She knelt down and read it for the first time. Donated by the Renfrew Foundation, 1991. Renfrew. She traced the word with one finger. It meant nothing to her. It should mean everything to you. Because at that same hour, across town, a phone was ringing on Leonard Pruitt's desk at Eastgate High, and the voice on the other end was asking very politely for everything in Marin Calloway's academic file. Day 3, 2:47 in the afternoon, a long black limousine turned onto Marin Street. You have to picture what that looked like. This is Larkin Flats. Potholes deep enough to swallow a sneaker, chain-link fences with morning glory strangling through them. A block where the nicest car is a 15-year-old sedan with a cracked windshield and a spare tire that's been the real tire for 2 years. And here comes this thing, long, low black, polished so clean you could see the white sky sliding across the hood. It moved slow, real slow, like it was hunting for an address it already knew, but wanted the whole street to watch it arrive. Kids on bikes stopped pedaling and just stood there straddling their frames, mouths open. A woman watering a flower bed across the way dropped her hose and let it run across the sidewalk, water snaking toward the gutter while she stared. 2 men on a porch down the block set down their dominoes mid-game and leaned forward. The whole street seemed to hold one breath. You could feel the wrongness of it, the way the limousine sat in that frame. It was too long for the street, too clean for the street. The kind of car that belonged in front of a hotel with a doorman, not idling between a boarded-up duplex and a yard where a dog slept in the dirt under a busted swing set. It looked less like a car arriving and more like a door opening between 2 worlds that were never supposed to share an address. The limousine stopped right in front of the Calloway house. Nothing happened for a moment. The engine idled. The dark glass gave away nothing. Then the driver's door opened and a man stepped out, tall, broad, gray suit, the same man from the SUV, Hank Mosley. He walked to the rear door, squared his jacket, and opened it. And the man who climbed out made Marin's knees go loose. He was tall and straight-backed and clean-shaven, white hair combed neatly to the side. He wore a tailored navy suit, the kind that doesn't come off any rack, the kind that's built around a man by people who know his name. A silk tie, a folded square in the breast pocket, and in his right hand a polished cane with a heavy silver handle, except he wasn't leaning on it. He was carrying it, the way a gentleman carries a thing he doesn't need, like a man who owns the ground under his shoes. His eyes were ice blue, sharp, unmistakable. Marin was inside when she heard the car doors. She came to the window and looked out through the curtain and went completely still. "Grandma," she whispered. "Grandma, come here." Ruth shuffled to the window. She saw the limousine. She saw the man in the navy suit walking up their cracked path. She saw the cane, and the silver handle caught the afternoon light and something on it flashed. A crest, a small letter R inside a geometric shape. The same R that was pressed into the stationery in her kitchen drawer. Ruth's hand went to her mouth. She knew that name. Not the man, the name, the way everyone in Shreveport knew it. Arthur Renfrew. The man who had built half the commercial district downtown. The man whose foundation had put its name on a children's hospital wing, on library walls, on park benches across the whole city. The man who had stepped out of public life 5 years ago after his wife died, stopped showing up to the board, stopped showing up to Gallus, stopped showing up to anything at all. Arthur Renfrew, 82 years old, founder and chairman emeritus of the Renfrew Group. Net worth by the last number anyone had printed, $3.6 billion. And 3 days ago he'd been slumped on a bench in Holloway Park, barely breathing, while an 18-year-old girl with an empty stomach fed him her last slice of bread. He had walked 5 miles in the July heat that day. No phone, no water. He'd slipped away from his driver again, the way he'd been doing for months, drifting on foot through the same neighborhoods his company had once stood up at press conferences and promised to revive, and then never had. He'd been ready to stop, not just for that afternoon, for good, for everything. And then a girl had knelt down on the hot concrete and said, "I'm not going anywhere." Ruth opened the screen door, the one that doesn't latch, the one that groans on its hinges. Her hands were shaking. The powerful old man on her porch looked nothing like the dying figure Marin had described. This man radiated money and weight and command. The eyes. Marin would know those eyes anywhere. She stepped past her grandmother onto the porch. "That's him," she said quietly. "That's the man from the bench." Arthur Renfrew looked at her and smiled, not a polite smile, a real one, the kind that begins in the eyes and takes over the whole face. "Hello, Marin." His voice was different now, full and strong, nothing like the cracked whisper from the park. "How did you find me?" she asked. "You told me your name. That was all I needed." A second figure stepped out of the limousine, a woman in her mid-50s, charcoal suit, a leather portfolio tucked under one arm. Straight posture, a steady warm face, the kind of face that runs meetings and doesn't waste a minute of anyone's time. Claire Renfrew, Arthur's daughter, the current chief executive of the Renfrew Group. She came up the porch steps and offered her hand to Ruth. "Mrs. Calloway, my name is Claire Renfrew. I'm Arthur's daughter." A small pause. "May we come inside? There are some things we'd like to talk through with you and Marin." Ruth looked at the outstretched hand. She looked at the limousine sitting in front of her boarded-up neighbors' houses. She looked at her granddaughter. Then she opened the groaning screen door wider and stepped aside. "Come on in," she said softly. "Forgive the house, we weren't expecting company." Arthur Renfrew stepped across the threshold. His blue eyes moved over the small kitchen, the nearly empty fridge, the shoebox of red-stamped bills, the disconnection notice under the crest-shaped magnet. He took it all in, and his jaw tightened, and he said nothing about it. Claire Renfrew had not come with a check. She had come with a blueprint. The four of them sat down at the Calloway's table. It was a small table built for two, and now it held 4 knees nearly touching underneath. Ruth had already apologized 3 times for having nothing to offer them. Arthur had waved each apology away. "Mrs. Calloway, please, sit. We're the ones who came to thank you." Claire set the leather portfolio on the table and unzipped it. Inside were printed documents, architectural renderings on heavy paper, and a letter on Renfrew Group letterhead, the same R crest that had been trailing Marin for 3 days now. "Marin," Claire began. Her voice was calm and professional, but there was something softer running underneath it. "My father told me what you did for him in that park. All of it, the water, the bread, the hour you spent keeping him awake when he was ready to let go." She paused. "He also told me what you said you wanted to be." Marin nodded. Her hands were in her lap and she didn't know what to do with them. "And he told me one more thing." Claire glanced at her father. "He told me that the $200 he left on your porch, you carried it straight to a food pantry the same morning and gave it away." The kitchen went quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Arthur leaned forward, his blue eyes fixed on the girl. "I've built a company worth billions of dollars, Marin. I've sat across from senators and presidents of companies and men who would step over a dying stranger to make a meeting on time." His voice stayed low and even. "And in 82 years of living, no one has ever done for me what you did on that bench." He laid one hand flat on the table. "So we're not here to say thank you. Thank you is too small. We're here to make sure the kind of person you turned out to be gets the kind of life she's earned." Claire opened the portfolio the rest of the way and turned it so Marin and Ruth could see. "There are 4 things we'd like to offer. I want you to hear all 4 before you say anything. First, your education. A full scholarship. Not to just any school, to the Latimer College of Architecture and Design. It's one of the strongest architecture programs in the country." She slid a sheet across. "Tuition, books, materials, housing, transportation. All of it covered through the Renfrew Foundation's education fund. 4 years, every dollar." She looked up. "You told my father you wanted to build spaces that make people feel safe. This is where you learn how to do it for real." Marin's lips parted, no sound came out. "Second, your grandmother." Claire turned to Ruth and her voice gentled. Comprehensive medical coverage, specialist appointments starting this week, the best orthopedic team in the city for those knees, a full prescription plan, a home health aide twice a week to help with whatever you need. She drew out another page, and every outstanding medical bill in that shoebox, every single one paid in full, effective today. Ruth's hand went to her chest. Her chin began to tremble. She tried to say something and couldn't get it past her throat. Third, the house. The Renfrew Group would buy the home from the landlord outright. Full, new roof, new wiring, new plumbing, new kitchen, a heating and cooling system that actually worked. Everything gutted and rebuilt from the studs out, and when it was finished, the deed would be transferred into Ruth Calloway's name. Free and clear, no rent, no mortgage. Hers. "This is your home, Mrs. Calloway," Arthur said quietly. "It ought to feel like one." Ruth couldn't hold it anymore. A tear slid down one cheek, then another, and she gripped the edge of the table with both hands like the floor had tilted under her. Marin reached over and took her grandmother's hand and held it tight. Fourth. And this was the one that turned the whole thing into something larger than one family. Arthur stood slowly and walked to the kitchen window. He looked out at the street, the cracked pavement, the boarded house next door, the empty weed-choked lot across the way. "I walked through this neighborhood 3 days ago, Marin, on foot, for the first time in years, and I saw something I should have seen a long time ago." He turned to face her. "My company bolted its name onto that park bench in 1991. We held a press conference. We promised to invest in this part of the city. We promised to bring it back." His voice dropped. "We didn't. We took the photograph and we left. That's on me, nobody else." He came back to the table. Claire laid out the renderings, full color plans for a community center, an after-school arts program, new walking paths, new playground equipment, renovated housing along the block. "The Renfrew Group is committing $12 million to a revitalization fund for Larkin Flats," Arthur said. "A community center, expanded food pantry, job training, housing repairs, all of it right here. Not a check mailed to a charity downtown here." He looked at her. "And I want you to be the youth ambassador for it. The face of it. The person who shows people what this neighborhood actually is, instead of what they assume it is." He leaned in. "You told me you wanted to build things that make people feel safe, so let's start with your own block." The kitchen was perfectly silent. Ruth was crying freely now, not loud, not dramatic, just tears running steadily down her face and dropping onto the table. Marinson sat very still, her eyes wide, her lips pressed together, holding it all somewhere behind her ribs. Then she spoke, barely above a whisper. "Can I still volunteer at the food pantry?" Arthur Renfrew laughed. A real laugh, deep, the kind that comes up out of the belly and fills a small room. The kind his daughter had not heard out of him in 5 years, not since the morning her mother's chair stayed empty at breakfast. "I'd be disappointed," he said, "if you didn't." Marin nodded, and that was the whole of her reaction to 4 offers that would have left most people on the floor. She did not throw her arms around anyone. She did not cry, though her eyes were bright. She looked, if anything, a little tired, the specific tiredness of a person who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has just felt one strap, only one, lift off the shoulder. The relief of it was almost too big to feel all at once, so her body let in only as much as it could hold. The rest would come later, in pieces, over weeks. In the middle of an ordinary afternoon, she'd remember the renderings on the table and have to sit down. And while Marin pulled the renderings closer and started sketching a change to the entrance on the corner of one page, already dreaming out loud, already at work, Claire leaned toward Ruth and spoke low, just for the two of them. "Mrs. Calloway, my father hasn't laughed like that since my mother passed." She paused. "Your granddaughter didn't only save his life in that park," she reminded him why it was worth saving. Ruth squeezed Claire's hand, and for the first time in longer than she could name, she didn't feel tired. But the world wasn't finished testing the girl, not yet. By September, Marin Calloway walked through the gates of the Latimer College of Architecture and Design on the first day of classes. New backpack, new shoes. The heavy professional sketchpad Arthur had left on her porch tucked under one arm, already half full. She was nervous, and you could read it in the way she held her shoulders high and tight, braced for something. Most of the students around her had come up through private academies and prep schools. They had portfolios that tutors had helped polish. They had parents who were architects and engineers and named the buildings they'd designed at the dinner table. Marin had a grandmother who'd spent 30 years sorting other people's donations, and a sketchbook full of faces drawn on a park bench. But she belonged there. It didn't take long for everyone to find that out. There was a young man in her first studio named Spencer Vane. Money behind him, the kind of money that had never once worried about a power bill. A watch on his wrist worth more than the Callaway house had been worth before the renovation. On the second week, when the professor mentioned that several students were attending on scholarship, Spencer said, not quite under his breath but close, "Makes sense. You can always tell. They design like people who've never actually lived anywhere nice." A couple of students laughed. Marin kept her eyes on her drafting table and said nothing. Her pencil didn't even pause. The first major project was a scale model, free brief, design a building that mattered to you. Spencer built a glass tower, all sharp angles and reflective skin, the kind of thing that looks expensive in a render and cold in real life. Marin built a community center for Larkin Flats. Open floor plan so a room could be a classroom in the morning and a meal hall at night. Big windows angled to pull in natural light all day, because she knew what it was to do homework by a flickering bulb. A rooftop garden. Space for art classes, for tutoring, for job training, for a pantry with a real kitchen attached. Every corner of it designed around one quiet idea: make whoever walks in here feel like they were expected. When the professor reviewed the studio, he picked up Marin's model and held it in front of the whole room. "This," he said, turning it slowly so everyone could see, "is what architecture is supposed to do." He set it down and looked over the top of his glasses. "It is not about the most expensive material in the room. It is about who you were thinking of when you drew the door. There's a small thing you should know about that semester, and I'll tell it plainly because the story didn't make a big show of it, and neither will I. At the end of the term, the studio gave out a single award for the strongest project, and it went to Marin. And the firm that funded that award anonymously for years, the name was sealed in an envelope the dean opened that night, was the Renfrew Group." Spencer Vane went a little pale when he heard it, but here's the part that mattered, and the part Marin held on to. She didn't gloat, she didn't say a word to him. She just packed up her model in bubble wrap, careful with the little rooftop garden, and carried it home on the bus to show her grandmother. Being right had never been the point. The door was the point. Back in Larkin Flats, Ruth Callaway was walking. Not shuffling, not gripping the furniture and breathing through her teeth, walking. The knee replacement happened in October, performed by the kind of surgeon Ruth had never imagined she'd sit across from in a clean, bright office. 6 weeks of recovery. A physical therapist who came to the house 3 times a week and was patient and a little funny and made Ruth laugh through the hard parts. And one morning in December, Ruth pushed up out of her kitchen chair and walked clear across the room without touching a single thing for balance. She stopped in the middle of the floor and looked down at her own legs and cried. The kitchen she was standing in was new. Stone counters, a stove where all 4 burners actually lit, a refrigerator that was full, not half empty, not rationed, full, milk and eggs and vegetables and a bowl of real fruit and leftovers in containers with the lids snapped on. There were magnets on the door. They weren't holding a disconnection notice anymore. They were holding Marin's college acceptance letter and a photo of the 2 of them squinting into the sun. The house itself had transformed, new roof, fresh paint, a soft blue that Marin had chosen off a fan of swatches at the kitchen table, a porch that didn't groan, a screen door that latched on the first try every time with a small satisfying click that Ruth found she loved. And out front a little garden Ruth planted with her own hands once her knees would let her kneel. Tomatoes, collard greens, a row of marigolds along the walk. Neighbors slowed when they passed it, not with envy, with something closer to hope, like maybe if that house could change, theirs could too. And they were right, because the $12 million fund was only getting started. Crews broke ground on the community center in November, and here's what mattered most about it. The people swinging the hammers were mostly hired off these same blocks, local hands building a local future. The center was designed with real input from Marin herself. She'd sent sketches to the foundation's architects during her first month at Latimer, and they used 3 of her ideas, 3 from a freshman. The name of the center Marin insisted on, the Ruth Callaway Community Center. Ruth protested. "You put your own name on it, baby. You did the work." "No, ma'am," Marin said. "You built me. This one's yours." Holloway Park got new playground equipment, new walking paths, lighting that didn't flicker, benches added rather than just repaired. The pond got dredged and cleaned, and by spring there were fish in it again, small and silver flickering under the surface. It became the kind of park where families actually came, where kids stayed out until sunset and old men set up folding chess sets on the tables on Saturday mornings. The story went public in January. A local reporter named Dana Whitlock put together a segment, "The Girl Who Shared Her Last Bread." 3 minutes long, simple. Just Marin and Ruth and Arthur sitting together at the new kitchen table, telling it in their own words. It went around the country in 48 hours. The pantry donations Pastor Mathers received tripled, the fund doubled. Strangers from states Marin had never visited mailed in $5 bills with notes that said things like, "This is my slice." A national morning program flew her up for an interview, and she brought Ruth and Pastor Mathers and sat the three of them on the studio couch under the hot lights. When Marin got to the part about giving away the $200, the host had to stop and look away from the camera and collect herself before she could ask the next question. Pastor Mathers's pantry, lifted by the fund and the flood of donations, grew into a full community kitchen. Hot meals 3 nights a week, volunteers driving in from across the city, and every Saturday morning without fail there was Marin, stacking cans, sorting bags, same as before. Some things don't change, the best things don't. As for Arthur Renfrew, he came back to life. He started driving out to Larkin Flats every week. He played chess in the park with the retirees and lost more games than he won and didn't seem to mind. He sponsored a summer art camp and asked Marin to help run it. His appetite came back. His color came back. And his daughter told a reporter something near the end of that year that stopped people cold when they read it. A girl who had nothing did what 5 years and a wall full of medications couldn't. She gave my father a reason to get up in the morning. There's one more thing from that year I want to give you, because it's small and it's the kind of thing the big version of this story never bothers to mention. Sometime that spring, the woman who sang hymns to nobody on her porch, the one Marin had drawn that first afternoon on the bench, got her own porch rebuilt under the housing repair part of the fund. New boards, a real railing, a roof over it so she could sit out in the rain. And the evening they finished it, she came out and sang, the way she always had, to nobody in particular. Except it wasn't nobody anymore. 3 or 4 neighbors had drifted over to sit on the new steps, and a couple of the construction guys stayed past quitting time with their tools still on their belts, and they all just listened to her crack on the high notes the way she always did. Marin wasn't there for it. She was up at Latimer that night, bent over a drafting table. But Ruth told her about it on the phone, and Marin wrote it down in the back of the professional sketch pad, on the page after the old man with the ice blue eyes, because some things you want to keep. 1 year after the bench, Marin went back to it, and this time she wasn't alone. It was a Tuesday, late July, the same week of the same brutal month, the same Louisiana sun pressing down on everything like a wide, flat hand. But the park was a different place now. The pond was clean and the grass was green. Really green. Not the brown brittle stuff that crunched underfoot a year ago. Children shrieked and chased each other through a new splash pad near the swing set. A cluster of teenagers were up on a ladder painting a mural across the side wall of the community center. The Ruth Calloway Community Center, its doors propped wide open, music drifting out into the heat. Marin walked past all of it, past the new playground, past the walking path, past family spread out on blankets in the shade. She went straight to the bench. It had been fully restored, the wood smooth and dark under her hand. The original brass plaque was still bolted there, polished bright, donated by the Renfrew Foundation, 1991. But there was a second plaque now, mounted just beneath it, smaller and newer, engraved in plain letters, where one shared meal saved 2 lives. Marin sat down. She was carrying a brown paper bag and she set it on her lap and waited. 10 minutes later she heard it, the slow tap of a cane on the walking path. Not heavy, not labored, just steady and familiar. Arthur Renfrew came around the bend. No limousine today, no suit, just khaki trousers and a light blue shirt and that same silver-handled cane, though he barely leaned on it anymore. Hank Mosley trailed 20 steps back, hands clasped, keeping a respectful distance, half smiling. Arthur lowered himself onto the bench beside her. Neither of them spoke right away. They watched the pond, the light moving on the water, the far-off sound of the splash pad and the kids. Then Marin opened the paper bag. Inside were 2 slices of fresh bread made into sandwiches with peanut butter. The good kind, the brand you buy when your refrigerator is full and your grandmother is healthy and your life has room in it for small beautiful things. She handed one to Arthur. He took it. They ate together in silence, the way people do when words aren't necessary, when sitting beside someone says all of it. This had become their ritual. Once a month, bread on the bench. Sometimes they talked about architecture, about the new wing she was already imagining for the center. Sometimes about Ruth. Sometimes about Arthur's wife, the woman with the kind eyes in the wallet photograph, and the things he'd never gotten to say. Sometimes they didn't talk at all. Then a small voice, "Hey, mister." They both looked up. A boy stood a few feet off, maybe 8 years old, skinny, in shorts that were a size too big, holding a granola bar in one hand. He was looking at Arthur, at the old man resting on the bench with a cane at his side, with wide, serious eyes. "You want this?" the boy said. "You look like you might need it." Arthur looked at Marin. Marin looked at the boy, and she smiled, the kind of smile that starts slow and then takes over your whole face. Arthur took the granola bar and held it gently, like it was worth more than anything anyone had ever handed him. "Thank you, son. What's your name?" the boy told him. And just like that, quietly, music swelling, no cameras, the circle started over. Wide shot, the park, the laughter, the half-finished mural, the pond catching the last gold of the afternoon, and Marin Calloway sitting on the bench where all of it began, opening her sketchbook to a brand new page. I've told a lot of stories on this channel. Stories about people who had everything and people who had nothing, and what happens in the small terrible second when those two worlds touch. But I keep circling back to this one, and I want to be honest with you about why. It isn't the billionaire. It isn't the limousine on the broken street, or the 4 gifts, or the house with the new blue paint. Those are the parts that look good in a thumbnail, and they're real, and I'm glad they happened. But they're not the part that stays. The part that stays is that she had one slice of bread. One, the last food in the house, and she didn't agonize over it, she didn't weigh it. She tore off a corner and pressed it to the mouth of a man she'd never met, because he was dying and she was there and nobody else was. An 82-year-old man worth $3.5 billion said no one in his entire life had ever done for him what that girl did with a piece of plain bread. And he was right, and it had nothing to do with the bread. It was about the kind of person who gives when every single reason says don't, who stays when staying costs her the only thing she has left. So here's what I can't shake, and I want you to actually sit with it, not just scroll past. If generosity only counts when it's comfortable, when it's the spare change, the leftover, the part you weren't going to use anyway, is it even generosity? And if the person with the least to give is the one who gave the most, what does that say about the rest of us, with our full refrigerators? Go back and watch the bench scene again, by the way. Watch his shoes. Watch the wool cardigan in the July heat. It was all right there from the first minute, if you knew to look. She didn't look. She didn't need to know who he was to decide he was worth saving. That's the whole thing. That's the entire story in one breath. So let me ask you the only question that matters here. What's your slice of bread? Drop it in the comments. I read them and I want to know. If this one moved something in you, leave a like and send it to one person who needs to hear it today. And if you're not subscribed yet, come sit with us. We tell stories here that try to remind you the world is still somehow worth believing in. I keep coming back to one detail in this story, and it isn't the limousine. It's that she never asked who he was. She didn't need to. A man was slipping away on a bench, and she was there, and that was the whole equation for her. I've thought about that more than I'd like to admit, about how often I wait to find out if someone deserves my help before I give it. She didn't wait. She had one slice of bread and an empty house behind her, and she still chose the stranger. So that's the question I'll leave you with tonight. What would you have done, honestly, if you'd been the one to walk past that bench? I'll see you on the next one.